We are joined now by Republican Senator John Thune of the great state of South Dakota, who is also the Senate Minority Whip. And Senator, we mentioned that private moment. I want to get into some of the topics of this address, but also the tone, because there were public moments of disagreement we're not used to seeing at a State of the Union. The president was called a liar a couple times. There were some outbursts about whether he was to blame for the fentanyl crisis. There were definite Rocky Horror Picture Show vibes at various moments here. And before we get into the content, I'm curious what you think the American people should take away from what they saw last night.
Well, I think, Tony, what they saw obviously was a president. People could characterize it as a soft launch for his re-election campaign. There was a lot of red meat that he threw out there, and the reaction in the chamber was probably pretty predictable. Democrats were very boisterous in their support, and Republicans, of course, not so much. And I think that again, the tone of State of the Union speeches, at least in my the modern era in which we live politically, there is more, I would say, activity in the chamber probably than there used to be. But, I think that's probably characterizes a little bit of the change in our politics. I mean, people are a lot more, they get out there a lot more outspoken. And I think the State of the Union speeches are perhaps a good example of that.
Senator David Begnaud here. Good morning to you. There were some moments of bipartisanship, right? The president mentioned more police resources, and he recognized the family of Tyree Nichols. And there were a lot of Republicans who clapped and stood for that. Are Republicans ready to work with Democrats on police reform?
We are, and I very much hope that we could get something done there. There were attempts made in the past, several attempts made in the past, as recently as 2020, which eventually sort of fell apart. But we've got a great leader on that issue. Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina has done a lot of good work on police reform, and he really tried to push that issue forward. And in the end, it was the Democrats who walked away from the table. So yes, there are, I think, about 70 to 80% of the issues around police reform are things that both sides agree on. So what we ought to try and do is find that common ground and see if we can actually execute on getting some reforms across the finish line. I think the opportunity is there, and I hope there will be the will on both sides to put it together.
Senator, on this question of the debt ceiling, there was a moment, and this was one of those call and response moments, where the president criticized some Republicans for wanting to make cuts to Social Security, some changes there. He's referring to a proposal from Senator Rick Scott, someone who I've actually talked to on this subject. But just to be abundantly clear for the American people, where does your party stand on cuts to Social Security and Medicare?
Tony, I think what you heard last night is, both sides agreeing that there aren't going to be cuts to Social Security or Medicare. I do think, however, and the debt limit is a good place to do this, is to actually realize that we got a $31 trillion debt. It's not going away. We spend more than we take in every year, and you can't solve all that just by raising taxes, which is, a lot of what the president proposed last night. You actually have to figure out, how do we strengthen these programs? And that doesn't mean you have to cut things, but there are a lot of younger Americans today who understand that if something isn't done, Social Security isn't going to be around for them. I mean, if you're talking about huge cuts in this program not too far down the road when it goes bankrupt, if we don't do some things to make it stronger and make it viable, not just for current generations, but also for future generations of Americans. And there are things that are out there. There's a proposal out there right now which is bipartisan. Bill Cassidy, he's got half a dozen Republicans, half a dozen Democrats on Social Security reform. And it does it in a way that strengthens the program, avoids those steep cuts that would occur in the future. And I think it's, that's the kind of thing we ought to be talking about, because both sides have to agree. We can't sustain this. You can't have $31 trillion in debt and climbing every year. And I think the president, if he wants to, this could be a real legacy issue. He could come to the table, and it's going to take presidential leadership to do something big and consequential like this. And I think Republicans would meet him there.
Yeah, we'll have to see what happens. Strengthening the country for the future is what it is all about. A gentleman of the Senate, Senator John Thune, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, guys.